Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 39 of the Ask Historians podcast. So today we have the first of two parts, which is going to be covering what was mainly aimed at Algeria, but we kind of roamed a bit far afield. So we're going to be looking at essentially the decolonial process of France and the rise of counter-insurgency tactics. First, starting from the French Indochina War at the end of World War II, and then moving forward from that, from Dien Bien Phu and the kind of the transition from that being the French Indochina War into the Vietnam War. At that point, we're going to transition over to Algeria and look at essentially how France dealt with this concept of part of actual metropolitan France, at least conceptual wise, that the French were much less willing to let go, particularly after the loss of Indochina. So we'll spend about the first half hour in Indochina, and then we'll move over to Algeria, and we'll start talking about the kind of social and political situation that's happening there. And we'll end with the Phillipeville massacre for this episode, and then we'll pick up from there in the next episode and kind of follow out the rest of the Algerian War.
Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Ask Historians podcast. Today I'm here with Stefan, or Bernardito, as he's known on the Ask Historians subreddit, and we're going to be talking about the Algerian War, but also kind of in a more general sense about counterinsurgency. So Stefan, why don't you go ahead and give us an idea about what got you interested in this subject, or subjects, I guess I should say.
Well, like everyone else, I am a man of my time. I was, molded in a particular context, and that context is the post-9/11 world that we live in. I am not American, as some like to think of me as. I'm actually Swedish. And I was, I watched a lot of the news, in my most, the time when I was becoming to think of, what sort of interests me in history and stuff like that. And what was so present, was the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I wanted to understand what was happening, why it was happening, and what exactly did people mean when they said, oh, why don't we just do this? So why don't we just do that? And I actually wanted to know, why don't we just do that? Or why is that a wrong approach? So I started studying, and I started out with the Vietnam War, and it sort of escalated from there.
As wars tend to do, yeah.
Exactly, to include the Algerian War, the war in Malaya, all sort of different conflicts during the Cold War. But I do stretch my studies within counterinsurgency back to post-1856, sort of with how guerrilla warfare was starting to enter its sort of modern stage, which you wouldn't actually do. The origins of modern guerrilla warfare is in the Cold War. But I've had a lifelong interest in military history, in modern military history. And when the time came to, when I entered university and stuff like that, I always wanted to focus on military history, sort of to break, because in the US, you have this sort of almost stigma against military history. You think of dusty old men thinking about moving battalions here and there and there. And I want to sort of break that stigma and sort of enter a, within quotation marks, civilian university and talk about military history on an academic level.
I like the fact that we probably won't go all the way back to the 1850s, but I do like the fact that you brought up the idea of going back to, starting in Vietnam, because, of course, when you talk about the Algerian War, you have to go back to not the Vietnam War that most Americans think of, but the preceding conflict, the conflict that came before it, because after World War II, we start to see the breakup of these European empires overseas, and part of that was the breakup of the French Empire, including forces in what was then called French Indochina, nationalist forces trying to get their own independence. Can you give us a little bit of background there?
Absolutely. So France finds itself after World War II a sort of destroyed nation. It has endured a war since 1939, if we're gonna be correct about it, but probably since 1940. It has suffered tremendously, yet it wants to go back to its pre-war status as a superpower, essentially. So it looks towards its colonies in Indochina as a sort of lifeline that we have to keep this, because if we don't have colonies, we won't be a superpower. So what happens is that in 1946, it decides upon the fact that it needs to almost reconquer what is today Vietnam, but would later also include Cambodia and Laos in overall French Indochina. In 1946, even though, if I may just interrupt myself, in September 1945, some historians can argue that that's when the war starts in southern Vietnam, where insurgents face off against not only British troops, actually, who were there to actually help reinstate French power, but also turned Japanese troops who were now fighting other Japanese troops fighting on the Viet Minh side.
So you say insurgents, but who are we really talking about here? Because you just mentioned the Viet Minh right there.
Yes, that's an excellent question. The Viet Minh was a national, you can almost call it a national front of different political groups, nationalist, communist, and everything in between, that was essentially led by communists. Because if I may just once again interrupt myself, in the Maoist, from Mao Zedong, his guerrilla theory has that you had to have a united front before you start a guerrilla warfare. So when the Indochinese Communist Party created essentially the Viet Minh, they had this in mind to, of course, not exclude anyone.
Founded by this communist group, but with an idea of encompassing all Vietnamese people, so a more kind of nationalistic take, I guess you'd say.
Absolutely. I mean, we have to see, of course, the fact that history is complex and it's never black and white. So Viet Minh becomes and uses communist rhetoric. Its propaganda is communist in nature, and more importantly, however, it's led by an incredibly charismatic, very nationalist-minded and both Marxist-minded man who went by the nickname of Ho Chi Minh, the Enlightened One, who had actually, almost ironically, was actually one of the founding members of the French Communist Party.
So, but at this point, we're not looking. Are we looking at what we would kind of call irregular warfare? The French are landing their units that are now being freed up from Europe to go over and kind of, as you say, not quite reconquer, but at least reestablish French power in this area. What is the organization of the Viet Minh forces?
The Viet Minh forces are very much like the classical ragtag guerrilla force that during the 1960s was more applied to the Viet Cong. The Viet Minh had not a lot of training, not a lot of experience at all. They had very little funding. They had very little equipment. They had essentially everything that a guerrilla warfare, that a guerrilla organization should have, and they didn't have it at the moment in 1946. So what happened was that the Viet Minh had, after the defeat of the Japanese during World War II, they had essentially taken over northern Vietnam, what would then become North Vietnam during the 1960s, 1950s, late 1950s. They took over from the nationalist Chinese who had come to essentially become the occupying force to, take over while a French government was reinstated. Essentially, the Viet Minh in 1946 was in control of northern Vietnam. So to reconquer North Vietnam, the French first moved towards Hanoi. It's very interesting because not a lot of, even in the studies of the French Indochina War, not a lot of actual focus is put on the opening engagements in Hanoi, which was more or less like an urban warfare. But they retreated quickly to the countryside, as per the Maoist guerrilla theory, where the power is in the rural areas. They kept themselves to the border area in China, in northern Vietnam, in a place called the Viet Bac. And that's when that's where this insurgency really began to pick up pace. We see military offensive from the French side, trying to knock out this nascent insurgency that was just trying to pick up pace in operations such as Operation Lê in 1947, trying to capture leading Viet Minh officials and leaders and generals, and trying to supply depots and everything else that they can. But every single time the Viet Minh escaped, they escaped from all sort of encirclements and stuff like that and just regrouped elsewhere.
So it sounds like the French were able to, kind of take back the major population centers, the urban areas, the cities, the Saigon, Hanoi. But, with this doctrine of Maoist guerrilla warfare being, okay, you can have the cities, we'll have the rest of the country. When did the French realize that the tactics that they were using at that time, probably tactics that they were importing from World War II, just weren't quite working?
Well, I would make the argument that they never did. But in a more serious note, we have to also look at the French forces at this time, because the French forces, like I mentioned, it just came out of World War II. You don't have a lot of money you don't have the financial means to run this war. That's something we should not remember. The French government could not actually afford this war. There was no other country that was interested really in participating or in financing it, because, well, they were fighting a war of decolonization. The United States, were not interested in, helping them, retrieve their empire. That is, of course, until 1950. In 1950, we get a complete turnaround for both sides. And that happens with the creation of the People's Republic of China in 1949. China starts supporting the Viet Minh with everything from money to weapons to military advisors. Everything you can think of was thrown the Viet Minh way, while the French was finally able to get the United States on their side by saying, hey, you see what the Chinese are doing? They're communists. So, the Viet Minh, they're communists now too. So, you have to help us. Which lets the United States starting to, for their part, starting to pump in money into the France to support this war. They sent weaponry. They sent, also military advisors, but that played a far lesser role than the Chinese. Because it is, in contrary to the more popular, Cold War Vietnamese view, the Chinese played a huge, tremendous role for the Viet Minh to actually win the war. Because in my opinion, if it had not been for the Chinese, the Viet Minh would still do just local attacks. With Chinese help, they were able to reorganize, to get a proper military advice and planning.
So we're not just talking about a intensification of this guerrilla warfare. We're talking about the onset of pretty much straight out war then.
Exactly. What we're talking about is that the conflict enters the Cold War. It becomes one of those early conflicts in which, the West meets East in over communism and democracy and all that. Well, of course, anyone who really looks at it, there's not a lot of democracy involved, and there's not really no ideas of free elections and all that. No, of course not. But it was to constrain communism, to contain it. And that didn't go too well. What happened between 1950 and 1954 is proper warfare, not only on a local level, that is ambushes, but the Viet Minh army slowly, over the course of 4 years, turns from a ragtag guerrilla army that builds outdated World War II era submachine guns in their local factories to building a complete conventional army with artillery and with divisions and with everything you can think of to face the French.
So how does what we would now call counter-insurgency, how does that figure into this the French Indochina War then?
Well, that's very interesting that you asked, because the counter-insurgency in Indochina, out of a French perspective, it's not really that, it's not that effective at all. It's not even really carried out. What we know today as counter-insurgency is something that sort of comes out of the 1950s and the 1960s. But when the French really, started to wage war in Indochina, there wasn't really much of a thought about counterinsurgency as we know it today. It was more of colonial warfare. We have to remember that these armies, these soldiers, this French organization was built on conventional means. It was not supposed to fight a war in Indochina against insurgents. It was supposed to fight a war against, German forces or Soviet forces. And we can see that very clearly by how it waged the war. For example, it relied on a lot of motorization. It kept itself to the road. And the roads was a death trap. For example, just to take an example, Rue Colonial 4, for example, was made infamous by an absolutely almost perfect ambush by Vietnam forces on French forces there. They were moving towards a French post, I would say it. In this area in northern France, they would have a lot of these not fortifications, but most like military posts to control movement.
Something that we might call like a forward operating base in modern parlance.
Exactly, a forward operating base. So the Viet Minh thought like this: okay, we'll attack this base. Okay, so they will then call on their buddies because they will need to be rescued, or they will call for reinforcements, and they did. Of course, the French, of course, very almost like at a routine, came to help them. And what happened? Of course, the Viet Minh was there waiting for them and triggered an ambush, and that was one of the major sort of like early, almost like I would say conventional, but sort of semi-conventional battles involving the Viet Minh, and that did bring them a lot of confidence. But that confidence was not going to lead to good things, because what happened next was that the new commander-in-chief in Indochina, a World War I veteran named Jean de Lattre de Tassigny, took over command. De Lattre was a very popular, he brought a sort of renewed energy. The Viet Minh looked at the Red Delta, that is the rivers and the delta that sort of surrounds. It's very close to the Hanoi area. So what the French had done is that they had created what is called the De Lattre line, named after the general, that sort of almost like encircled this whole delta. You can imagine like, here's a city, right? The outlining area was completely surrounded in these posts, these, like I said, FOBs, the forward operation bases.
This idea of kind of like hold the city and hold the immediate surroundings as well.
Yes, because once again, that is very typical of the conventional thinking that, the cities, that's where, that's the really important part, the cities, not the people, not the Vietnamese peasants who the Viet Minh were teaching how to write and how to read just so they could properly make them politically conscious and so on. But so these bases were there to sort of check whatever infiltration the Viet Minh could push through. So the Viet Minh thought that, okay, if we push through these posts and we take Hanoi in a conventional fight, we win. So they did in what is called the offensive there in the 1950s and early 1951 in the winter there. And here, I think it's time that we also, if we're going to speak about the French Indochina War, that we also introduce General Vo Nguyen Giap, the very famed Vietnamese general who, at this time, was the commander-in-chief of the Viet Minh. So he devised this plan. He looks at the Route Colonial 4 battle, and he's like, okay, we're ready. We've proven ourselves in battle. Let's throw ourselves at these posts. Let's actually face in open battle. And they do a 3-part offensive, but it is completely beaten away because clearly the Viet Minh at this time was not a conventional army. It was still a guerrilla army trying to pretend to be a conventional army. But what happens is that Giap is he's opposed by someone sort of on the same level of sort of ingenuity and sort of energy. He's put against this French general who's been seeing warfare since War I, and it's not about to let some general from the colony, so to say, and I say this within quotation marks, try and defeat him at his own game. So what happens? For the first time in the history of Vietnam, napalm is called in. That leads to almost complete annihilation of the division involved. The Viet Minh reels back from that. They decided that we're not gonna try and push things conventional here in this part of North Vietnam.
Yeah, we'll fight on our terms, not on the French terms, I guess.
Exactly. So what happens is that they then begin to devise a new strategy. We're gonna stretch the French forces. They can't be everywhere at once. So of course they will focus on the Viet Bac, the sort of main Viet Minh headquarters, sort of the base area. They'll obviously be focused on offensives there. But what if we go to Laos? So what if we go to the border area of Laos and sort of attract them to go there, because they will have to very stretch the forces to go there. We'll have the initiative. They won't, they won't know what's coming.
So you've mentioned, before we get into kind of how this changed the nature of the French Indochina War, could we return back to kind of the French home front? Because I know you had said that this was a very expensive war, which, I mean, I would imagine just the shipping all these soldiers and equipment halfway around the world would be expensive. But also, France is a nation that, again, has been through quite a lot in World War II just a few years earlier. So how is this being supported? Is the American money being instrumental here, but also not simply the cost, but also the political cost? Is this a popular war back home? Is this opposed back in France?
It's most certainly not a very popular war. In fact, we see a lot of protests against it. We see a lot of, I wouldn't say confrontations, but I would say sort of protesters sort of confronting men going towards Indochina and saying, come on, you shouldn't go, come on, or being more hostile about it. What are you doing there and stuff like that. But more importantly, the idea of colonies and the idea of the post-war world, people were not really that interested in Indochina. They didn't have any stake in it. They were, of course, there were French settlers in Indochina, but they didn't exactly hold much political power in mainland France or Metropolitan France, mainly because it was a colony. It had really, beyond that, it was nothing else beyond that. Of course, we have to remember that Indochina was a profitable colony for France, but it's not to the extent that if they lost it, it would, change the whole, French economy.
Is that French economy able to sustain the level of warfare that is then going on?
Absolutely not. I mean, first of all, it is in crisis. Post-World War II is the reconstruction, and what happens, of course, is, you get the Marshall help. That comes much later for the mainland France. But it seems like a waste of money. Why do we need to be in Indochina when we need to build up what we already have in France? But like I mentioned before, the French professional troops, because there were no conscripts, no nothing. We're talking purely professional troops in Indochina this time. They were not well equipped. They were equipped with outdated weaponry. For example, Martin Windrow, the famous military historian who works primarily with French modern subjects, he mentions an example in which French paratroopers jump with World War I vintage rifles, just to show you how a lack of modern weaponry was also impairing them, until, of course, the Americans came around and started pumping into money into the war.
To return back to the actual conflict itself, so it seems like the new idea is to, instead of confronting the French directly at these very strongly held modern or urban areas, but to draw them out into the countryside where the Viet Minh forces have the advantage.
Precisely, and that leads to an offensive into Laos. Essentially, what it leads to is a continuous war, essentially, but just elsewhere, between Laos, between Vietnam, between these two territories. And I'm just going to try and sum it up as quickly as I can, because I'd like to also speak about what happens afterwards. But in 1952, we have the first French attempt to something called an air-land base, you can call it almost. Like, it was a stronghold or a forward operation base, but a very large forward operation base with its own airstrip and everything, that was supposed to sort of lure in the Viet Minh to attack on French terms, sort of make them think, oh, we're vulnerable, we have no lines of communications, come on, just attack us, come on. The Viet Minh would then charge, they would attack, and the French would be ready to just put all their firepower into what was approaching, and that would be it. And they would be able to be supplied from the air, and that would be it. And in the battle of the first battle in 1952, using one of these air land bases, leads to a Viet Minh loss because they fell for it. They thought that they were ready once more to fight on their terms, but they were not. This also, of course, makes the French very cocky and sort of confident about their abilities. So what happens then is that sort of leads us to what was to become the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954.
Yeah, so the French are essentially trying to replicate these held urban areas out in the countryside with these air-supported bases, I guess you could say.
Yes, exactly. They were trying to lure them in to sort of fight them at the French accord, so to say.
Yeah. So what happens at Dien Bien Phu then?
So the Battle of Dien Bien Phu is named after Dien Bien Phu. Clearly, shocking, and it was one of those air-land bases that was also put there. They were supposed to think that, okay, we can lure in the Viet Minh to attack this base. That will be it. Maybe we can actually, we could actually crack them. This air-land base, it's situated in this valley, surrounded by these mountains. The terrain for the French was perfect. They completely underestimated the Viet Minh, thinking that there's no way they could get artillery onto these surrounding mountains. There's no way. It's completely unheard of at this time that this would be a thing, that they would have the logistic means to do so. The only problem was that the French never expected the power of the people, in a way. They never expected the fact that that the Viet Minh could mobilize the population and their own army to essentially drag these artillery pieces in smaller pieces to the mountains, where they would then rebuild.
I mean, this is where we get or at least not the images, but at least the classic idea of, single file lines of Vietnamese, farmers essentially, all each carrying, one piece of artillery, to be assembled later, on bicycles or carrying it along by hand.
Exactly. That would be bicycles, example. It was a very, very popularized image, and it's very, very true because they did. And they managed. They managed to get those artillery pieces on those mountains, and they managed to move all of these divisions in preparation of a siege. The siege of Dien Bien Phu started in 1954, and in the spring of 1954, and it was a complete disaster for the French.
So I've often heard it. I think if most people know about Dien Bien Phu, it's usually just seen as kind of the turning point where the French said, okay, maybe this isn't winnable. I mean, is that kind of an accurate way of looking at it then?
I think it is not only a turning point in the Indochina War, it is a turning point in the history of wars of liberation, because for the first time, a guerrilla army had gone through three phases, the phases of Maoist insurgency, reached the level of a conventional army, and beaten a European military army at their own game. It is spectacular, and it inspired all sort of liberation movements all over the world, which we'll get to later. But yes, it did mean the turning point of the war, mainly because at the same time you had the Geneva Conference, which was they were negotiating regarding the future of Indochina, what was going to happen, and both sides used the Dien Bien Phu as an opportunity. If the French could beat the Viet Minh, oh well, that's good. And maybe they could keep Indochina in a way. If the Viet Minh got a major victory, then of course, then they would have a lot of money on the table. They would have a lot of cards to play.
Yeah. So is that then when the French basically call it quits then?
Yes. Dien Bien Phu is essentially where France just says, we can't, that's pretty bad, essentially, because they've been beaten not only, on a military side, but also political, because it was at the worst time possible. But it should be, of course, remembered that they still had a functioning army on the other side of the country, in close to Hanoi, for example, where they were still doing offensives during 1954, and even in southern Vietnam, there were also offensives there that would of course not lead anywhere, but still to show you that they still had a fight in them, but it wasn't enough to actually win the war.
Yeah, so is this one of those instances where this idea that the war could have been won militarily, but the political will was not there?
Absolutely. The end of the Indochina War led straight into what I would call the stab in the back myth of France. The professional soldiers, usually the elite soldiers, their officers and generals that were active in Indochina, they saw essentially these peace treaties, Geneva Accords, everything that came out of the Dien Bien Phu as a betrayal. That they did not lose the war, not through military means, but political means. That it was the home front, it was the politicians. They lost the war. To them, the idea that men had died in vain for Indochina, that to them was a huge betrayal.
I think this actually kind of starts to bring us right up to Algeria now, because you mentioned earlier that the defeat of the French in Indochina emboldened people. I mean, at the same time, we have these French soldiers coming back with kind of the idea that, they had fought for nothing and needing something to cling on to. But at the same time, to combine all these into kind of a triumvirate of conflicts, we also have stirrings of revolution in Algeria as well.
Absolutely. I'm going to start with the French, because the French, they come back from Indochina, the professional soldiers, they come back from Indochina. There's a Colonel Lacheroy. He writes a almost pamphlet book called La Guerre Révolutionnaire, the Revolutionary War, which was supposed to be like a counter-doctrine to the Maoist theory of guerrilla warfare. We essentially said that, we have to focus more on the people. It's the might of, how we win a conflict like this is by the people. Now, that is really good. That's really good. That's sort of what counter-insurgency is, sort of a battle over the mindsets of the people, the allegiance of people. But then there was a little thing there to the side that isn't as good. They tied the fact that the insurgents in Indochina had been communist in their view. They tied that to the fact that this meant that Moscow had the strings with all decolonizations, all the insurgents fighting for national liberation all over the world. So essentially what they were saying is that every single soldier fighting for the liberation of their country was a communist.
So we get this conflation between nationalist revolts against colonialism with, communist takeover orchestrated from above.
Exactly. And this sort of becomes almost like a conspiracy, and that sort of radicalizes these men even further.
So who actually was in Algeria then advocating for their own independence?
Well, there were a lot of groups, a lot of different political groups, ranging from moderate groups who wanted nothing but equality, essentially equality, but not independence, to those that wanted independence, but through means of democracy. We have to remember that Algerian nationalism was actually a very recent thing, because like another very recent author that's written about the Algerian War, Martin Evans, he points out very, very, very clearly that before the 20th century, there is no such thing as Algerian nationalism. Algerian nationalism essentially comes out of the early 20th century through the 1920s, through the 1930s, but there's no real talk of violence on the scale that Algeria is going to face. Not until a group of, you can call them disappointed. They're disappointed, they're almost frustrated with the democratic means, because Algeria is also inhabited by a large amount of European settlers.
So Algeria is kind of considered, and I think this is what really kind of separates it out from Indochina, is that, if I recall, Algeria is seen as basically part of Metropolitan France.
Absolutely.
It's part of France. It's not a colony.
Yes.
It's part of France.
It is France, which might be difficult for some people to think, in this day and age. But Algeria was to many people in France as French as Normandy or Brittany. This was because of the large amount of European settlers. Now, they were not all just French. They were Italian and Spanish settlers and, from all different nationalities. But there was a huge lobby of French settlers who had political power in Metropolitan France. And they were very, very adamant that they were not going to lose this power to the Algerians. To them, it was a social ladder. We are on the top, the Muslims are down on the bottom, and that's where they belong. So what happened when regular, moderate political parties, which were not illegal, it was accepted, it was completely legal for these Algerian Muslims to trying to enter their own Algerian assembly through democratic means. And that, let me just give an example. In 1947, there was a one of these elections for the assembly. There was almost unashamed vote rigging by the European settlers because they were not going to allow this. And as we will see later on, sometimes the settlers had powers that few other settler communities throughout history has ever had in political means.
Yeah, do we have kind of a I guess the term would be a second-class citizenship for Muslims or Arab, Berber, people living in North Africa? Is this more of just the Europeans holding all the strings of power and being able to use that to kind of manipulate things they want, or is there legal divides between them?
There is a very legal divide. The Algerian Muslims, and when I say Muslims, it's Arabs and Berbers. That's the sort of the term I'm going to use. So when I mean Algerian Muslims, so just there is, and we have to see that they're not seen as citizens. They are second-rate citizens in a way. They're not even they're just seen as sort of people that just live there. They're employed as, of course, they're employed as maids or as gardeners or things like that. But there is not a lot of contact between the settler community and the Algerian community, with some few exceptions, of course. Even among the settlers, there were those that were on the last step of the ladder, so to say, the lowest step of the ladder. I'm sorry. Which were usually the Spanish settlers. They were really sort of seen as the sort of slummish settlers, the poorest settlers, and they lived side by side with the Algerians in the Kasbah in Algiers, which is the capital of Algeria. But yes, they were not treated well at all. Just to give you another example, the French settlers owned huge tracts of land, which they used to, have vineyards and, all the sort of things that you would have expected of the Mediterranean. But for the Algerians, this meant that they had nowhere to have their own crops, and that meant that they starved, and they genuinely starved during this time because of the French settlers.
So when do these attempts to gain political power for Algerians through the the normal political means, when does that start to turn towards the idea that, well, maybe revolution, maybe violence may be the only answer?
It sort of becomes out of constant repression from the French. They started repressing, they started to ban certain political parties sometimes, vote rigging, like I mentioned, more or less just intolerance. They know that this group of young to, young when I say they were the middle age for what would become the Front de Libération Nationale, was between 28 to 35 years old. These men came out of already existing political parties who wanted and saw that the only way for us to gain independence was through violent struggle. People might be surprised, but it was actually rather late, actually during the 1950s, that these men started to group themselves in what was to become, in October 10th, 1954, just like a few weeks before the actual sort of uprising, that's when the actual organization gets its actual name, funny enough.
Yeah, and that's the FLN, the Front.
Yes, the FLN.
Yeah.
The Front de Libération Nationale, or the Front for National Liberation. And these were made up of Algerian men. Some of them, like Ahmed Ben Bella, were veterans of World War II, fought on the French side. The man who I mentioned, Ben Bella, had actually been present at the Battle of Monte Cassino in 1944. They saw that there was no way we can go on with trying to gain this through political means. We have to take to the bombs, to the armed force. These FLN leaders, they took inspiration from the French Indochina War. They saw what happened in the Dien Bien Phu. They saw that, they were defeated there. If the Vietnamese can do it, why can't we do it? They admired Ho Chi Minh, and when they began to build up this organization, they based it on, ironically, the French resistance during World War II and the Viet Minh.
When did they lead their initial strike then? You had mentioned a specific date earlier that they had organized just a few weeks before, but what is the significance of that date?
If I may, I'm just going to go back to July 1954 first, because that is a turning point, because that's when the FLN goes from thinking, okay, we have to get some concessions, because they wanted the original goal of the revolt was to gain concessions from France. It was not actually to gain full independence, but in July 1954, it's a complete turnaround. We're going to have full independence nonstop, and that's, like I said, a lot. Looking back at the large scale of French forces in Dien Bien Phu, that is where things starting to change for everyone. So 1954, they start getting a bit rushed, because the French had just lost the war in Indochina. What did that mean? Well, the French, they were weak. They must be weak because they just lost the war. So the FLN, the leaders are thinking, okay, we need to jump into action. We need to get the show on the road. And they do. They choose a date, November 1st, 1954. And they start coordinating all of these attacks that was going to happen on this day. Now, we get to November 1st, 1954, which is All Saints' Day, the Catholic holiday. Most of the settlers were Catholic, so that meant that the police, the gendarmerie, they would be on the minimum, and that the date itself would put an even greater impact on what would happen because of the martyrship of the Catholic All Saints' Day. So it would have sort of a symbolism. The FLN loved symbolism. In the early hours of November 1st, small armed groups of Algerian attack all over Algeria. They do bombings, they attack settlers, they attack police stations, they kill so-called Muslim collaborators, that is, Muslim police officers.
This is a general uprising. This isn't directed at one particular government building or directed at one particular city. This is across the country at multiple targets of basically symbols of French dominance. Precisely.
It was supposed to sort of create a spirit of resistance, essentially, to get, they were supposed to, we're going to revolt. And then, everyone else, they're going to follow us, right? They're definitely going to have to follow us after this. All the Muslims are going to rise up against the French. That did not happen. And the reason for that is because 9 years before this date, the infamous Sétif massacre happened, in which a large number of Muslims were killed in retaliation of Muslim attacks during a protest in the Algerian city of Sétif. This retaliation was very present in the mind of the Algerians at this time. So they remained passive because they did not want to experience the same sort of massacre again.
Yeah, so this idea of, okay, so we've had this mass uprising, but by this one group, now let's see if it actually lasts or if it's going to be stamped out very quickly.
Exactly. And the thing is that they had no mass following. The FLN failed in attracting much support in the beginning.
Which is really step one of that
yes
playbook.
Yes, exactly. You shouldn't start a insurgency without a mass following, first of all. They had really no coherent ideology. Sure, nationalism, but what else? And the organizational structure was also lacking because really, militarily and political, it wasn't quite there. Goals, they weren't really that specific. They were sort of vague.
I mean, it seems like they were set up to fail, but of course, it's an independent state now. But what was the French retaliation then? Did they, do we get another massacre?
That's the interesting part, because the French, just to give you an idea of just the impact of this, the French are so, almost unimpressed. They're like, oh, it's bandits. That's what it is. It's just local criminals doing attacks or whatever. Because it was nothing that had much of an impact on either the French government in Algeria. So they did what the French always do. They rounded up the usual suspects, which in this case meant innocent moderate Muslims. And that turned these innocent moderate Muslims against the French. There was, of course, some repression, like I mentioned. There were some local military actions, actually involving tanks and artillery. But overall, this period, these first 2 years, was characterized by appeasement, actually, and beliefs that, reforms, if we just give them something, they'll stop, making trouble, we will just give them this and, they'll stop. But that just simply wasn't the case. Reforms, it was too late for that. It was simply too late.
So, the French were thinking, okay, well, arrest a few local agitators and, give a few other people a couple seats on the town council, and that should solve this problem.
Precisely. It was sort of, let's give them a little more political representation, that's it. But, the military jumped into action, and the winter of 1954 and 1955 was very much a turning point for the FLN. The armed branch of the FLN was the ALN, the Army of National Liberation. The bases, usually in insurgencies, the guerrillas fight from bases. Sometimes it's across the border, and sometimes it's in very hard to reach places. In this case, it was mountains in the Auers, for example. And they were hunted back to their bases. They were hiding. They had constant pressure from the French military forces. They were starving. They were hungry, and they were really cold because they were freezing. It was winter. It was very much, for those Americans who are listening right now, it was like the Valley Forge of Algeria. They endured tremendous hardships, but they grew more experienced because of the hardship they endured and the military experience they gained through fighting the local security forces. But it was looking very bleak. The entire insurgency was reduced to around 350 insurgents. Yet, it should be pointed out, as we know, perhaps, for example, from the Cuban Revolution, sometimes the number of guerrillas isn't all that matters. Sometimes it's just that they need to know what to do with the time that has been given to them, to quote Gandalf.
Yeah, and what kind of support did the FLN have within the country? Because you said that essentially the French response was to these arrests and very moderate political benefits were really turning people more towards the independence and like that. But when the FLN is reduced back to these just a few people huddled up in the mountains, do they still have fairly widespread national support?
No, I wouldn't say so. In fact, widespread support doesn't come until late 1955, and even then it isn't that widespread. The reason for this is that with the FLN comes other groups who also wants to get a piece of the cake. They have their own ideas of how to fight for independence. So you have scattered communist groups. You have another group, the MNA, which is sort of the rival of the FLN, and who would see a lot of infighting between these two groups. So the war essentially also becomes a civil war between these Muslim Algerians as well. But if I move into 1955, the general governor for Algeria, Sostel, he says in the Algerian Assembly on February 23rd, 1955, that all must know, here and elsewhere, that France will not leave Algeria any more than she will leave Provence and Brittany. Whatever happens, the destiny of Algeria is French. The idea of Algérie Française is undeniable. Not only just to appease the settlers, we'll be on your side. No, but for the whole for the government in Metropolitan France as well. It was impossible to think of France, or rather Algeria, without France. So still, what does he do? He's still on this strategy of appeasement to sort of quell the rebellion. He does more reforms, more political representations. He starts carrying out agricultural and educational reforms, and what he does try is to sort of get some integration of the Algerian Muslims into the Algerian settler community, which really wasn't that effective.
Yeah, I have to say, I actually have a bit of a... This is a surprise for me hearing Jacques Soustel's name come up when I was doing kind of background research for this, and I have a bit of a soft spot for him because he's actually a Mesoamericanist and who wrote a very, essentially kind of a ubiquitous handbook on Aztec daily life that was, kind of ubiquitous in the late 20th century. So,
that's the charm of history. You never know what sort of characters will find themselves in all sorts of strange places and in strange contexts, and that's the beauty of it all.
Yeah, so I see him as kind of trying to redress some of the political and social ills that was causing revolution in Algeria at this time. But clearly this was not effective, though.
No, but he does create something that is effective. He creates something called the SAS, the Sections Administratives Spécialisées, which is a civic action unit, which I will come to a bit later. But just to mention, that was actually a really good idea that he created there for counter-insurgency. But what happens next is just awful. I'm just gonna say it right out. I'm trying to be very objectionable, but I'm trying to not be showing any bias. But what happens next is I wouldn't say rightful. There's no justice in this, and we have to remember that counterinsurgency and guerrilla warfare is usually very, there's no really moral responsibility usually. There's a lot of overstepping boundaries, and in combination with the reforms, there were also something called collective repression, or for attacks in local areas. So, for example, let's say a French police officer is killed, then that might mean that the whole village might have to be resettled, and all the population is essentially being forced out of the village. This was obviously not a popular policy amongst Algerian Muslims. And the FLN thought that to respond to this, we must reply in kind. Alice Dehaun, the very famous French historian, describes it as a total war on all French civilians. Attacks were planned against Phillipeville, Constantine, and the surrounding areas. FLN became agitators with these Muslim supporters, I would say, at this time, who were tired of repression, of violence, of what had been done towards their people, and they were unleashed onto the streets. What was to become known as the Phillipeville massacre is very ghastly to read about. I've chosen personally to not include any eyewitness accounts of the aftermath because the descriptions are very, 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 very hard to take, even for a man like me who's very used to this with the killing and torture and all this. But needless to say, these men enter these cities and they kill without mercy. In surrounding small cities and villages, entire settler families are massacred, including a baby who was only 5 months old. And this became a turning point for Soustelle and for the war itself. The French reprisals were so severe, and the massacre itself was of such horror, that it widened the chasm between the European settlers and the Muslims. Soustelle himself perhaps said it best when he described what he felt when he visited Phillipeville and the aftermath. He said that the Europeans saw terrorists in every Muslim. The Muslims feared reprisals by the Europeans. That sort of led to the fact that Muslims sort of started to become more to the FLN, because the Europeans become so hostile. There was no idea of reconciliation or anything. No, all Muslims were terrorists, and the Muslims knew that they were not going to end, well in the hands of a European.
And we're going to leave you there on that bit of a cliffhanger. When we come back in the next episode in 2 weeks, we're going to pick up with the reactions of France to the Phillipeville massacre and the actions they took following that. But I hope you can see in this episode why we started with Vietnam and French Indochina before moving over into Algeria. Not only because some of the tactics that, we can see this continuation of World War II tactics as applied to what are essentially colonial situations, and more importantly, World War II tactics applied to, not fighting another state, but fighting an actual nationalist movement. You're not fighting a state, you're fighting essentially a people. But also the fact that France, with the loss of Indochina, was even, more determined not to let this actual part of France, this, area of Metropolitan France go. It had that additional resolve of, militarily not wanting to get stabbed in the back again, and politically, not wanting to see the end of the French Empire. So when we return in 2 weeks, we'll see just what measures France is willing to take to hang on to this part of Metropolitan France and to avoid another military and political embarrassment, essentially. And we'll also see how the FLN manages to, get itself together, or in some ways not, but what measures the Algerian groups are also willing to take to fight for their liberation of their country. So I hope you'll tune in and come back for that. I've really enjoyed this interview with Stefan. He's a great host, especially considering that he's doing this in his third language. So I'm not sure any of us could be quite as eloquent and well-spoken as he is, particularly since he mostly did that, the Indochina part, basically from memory, because it was kind of a diversion of what we were planning on talking about, but it turned out very well. So in the meantime, feel free to rate and review us on iTunes. That gets us more eyeballs or earballs, and then more people know what you're talking about when you discuss obscure connections between French colonial government and Mesoamerican studies, or airland bases and ambushes along the Route 4, or basically the Algerian War itself, which that doesn't get the kind of press in, I guess you would say, the English-speaking world, as it does so much as, I guess you would say, in the Francophone sphere. But until then, you can check us out on SoundCloud. We have a new SoundCloud account that I'm putting up the past couple episodes on there. You can always just download us from whatever streaming service you have. If we're not on your favorite streaming service, let me know, and I'll endeavor to get us on there. We have a YouTube account that we are very slowly, at the pace of history, adding old accounts there. So if you want to stream it through YouTube, you can do that as well. And of course, you can always come by and ask questions to myself about the podcast, or to the guest here, Stefan Bernardito, who is the actual person you probably want to ask questions to, because he's saying the interesting stuff. That is, of course, on the Ask Historians subreddit. We put up a discussion post every time one of these come up, so feel free to drop by and ask any questions there. If you're getting this a couple days late, don't worry. I know Reddit tends to churn things out and have a high turnover, but any late coming messages that come in, they will go straight to my inbox, and I'll forward them on to Bernardito to be answered. So don't worry about joining the answer and joining the conversation in a historical sense. So until then, see you in 2 weeks.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. For more history like this, visit us at reddit.com/r/askhistorians and ask over 100 historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know in history. Find us on Twitter as @AskHistorians, and subscribe to the show on iTunes. Or visit askhistorians.libsyn.com. Thank you very much for listening, and join us next time on the Ask Historians podcast.